Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Today we're going to be talking about medical ethics because this is a subject that quite often comes up in Oxford interviews, and generally speaking it's a very good thing for anyone who's thinking of applying to medical school or biomedical sciences, or indeed anyone who's thinking of studying philosophy, or indeed any human being should probably have a think about this because it's really important and it's really interesting. So what we're going to do is focus on a particular interview question that was once used for admissions to medicine here at the University of Oxford. It's not a terribly nice interview question, but it does raise a really significant issue that we should grapple with. So the question goes as follows. Imagine that you are a doctor with a life-saving intervention. There's no details on what that intervention is, okay? The problem is that you only have one intervention available and there are 3 patients in need of it. And the patients include a baby girl, a middle-aged alcoholic man, and an 80-year-old great-grandmother. Okay? So who would you give the life-saving intervention to is the question. Now, as mentioned, it's not a terribly pleasant thing to think about, nor is it terribly realistic. It's not likely that a doctor would have such a situation with 3 very different patients and the task of deciding it being solely their own. Doctors don't have quite that much power. There are often guidelines from organisations like NICE in the UK, and there are legal standards and the courts might get involved. So this is not necessarily a realistic scenario, but it's what's called a thought experiment, and it's useful for teasing out how we can solve such a conundrum, even though it's not very likely to arise. So an important thing in an interview such as this is to engage seriously with the material, even though you might be tempted to think, come on, this isn't very likely to happen. That's true, but it's worth you having a good old think about it nonetheless. So the first thing that would be expected in an interview such as this would be for you to just think out loud, for you to just share your thoughts, and that would be absolutely fine. So perhaps sort of just start with what's your gut telling you. Interestingly, you have more brain cells in your gut than a cat has in its head, so you can literally do some cognizing with your guts. But what is your gut telling you about this question? Chances are, and this is where most people's guts tend to start with, is that you're thinking of giving the intervention to the baby girl. Okay, and that's very common first order response, and it's perfectly reasonable. But in any interview setting, the interviewers would encourage you through their follow-up questions to do a bit of what's called metacognition, which is where you think and reflect upon your thinking. So you think about your thinking, hence metacognition. And so what they might ask is, first of all, why? Why the baby girl? Okay, and you'd be encouraged to try and enunciate what's going on inside of your brain, right? Now, it could be that you go for the baby girl because of a sort of deeply ingrained instinct to protect the young, which is probably biologically woven into our genetics, but is also sort of socially reinforced, that we tend to have a very strong view that children should be saved. Their lives are very, very precious. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not trying to problematize that view in the slightest, but we're just trying to work out whether it's actually justifiable and to think about it critically. It's not to say that we are going to try and convince ourselves that it's wrong, because there is no right or wrong answer to this question, and that's part of the point. But just to make sure that we have left no stone unturned, right? That we've thought about this very carefully. Okay? And then the interviewers would follow up with other questions which would encourage a further line of metacognition. So they would just keep encouraging you to think about your thinking. So they might say, for example, does the gender of the individuals, does the fact that there's a baby girl and an alcoholic man and a great-grandmother, does that matter? Is that relevant at all? Is that a red herring that's been sort of thrown in quite unhelpfully? I mean, thinking about it, I would argue that the sexual identification, the sex assignment of those 3 individuals is irrelevant. I mean, we don't know what the intervention is, and we don't know what the disease is or what the prognosis is, which could, theoretically hinge on whether someone was biologically male, for example. But we don't know any of that information, so based off what we do know, it's probably not relevant to consider the sex or the gender of these individuals. It doesn't seem to help us, right? If it was a baby boy, it wouldn't make any difference. If it was a baby girl, then it's a middle-aged alcoholic man, seems irrelevant as well, okay? So let's take another step. Is it relevant that the man is alcoholic? Does that matter at all? Now, again, this is where our gut instinct might be to sort of say it does matter, because we may be of the view that alcoholism is a choice, a life choice, and that the man has acted poorly, and that if he is unhealthy as a consequence of his alcoholism, then the intervention may not work optimally and he might end up succumbing regardless. Now, we don't have any of those details. We don't know any of that sort of stuff about his likely prognosis or the extent of his alcoholism. But it's important to note that alcoholism is more generally thought of as a disease rather than as a poor life choice. And so actually alcoholism could be another red herring here. It's kind of irrelevant. It would be tantamount to saying a middle-aged diabetic man, and if a man had diabetes, would you consider that relevant in whether or not someone had an intervention? Arguably not. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly important. What about sort of obesity? What if it was an obese middle-aged man? Again, this is where there's a bit of a social understanding that things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, alcoholism, these are all a consequence of poor life choices. But more and more research suggests actually these are forms of, or consequences of addictive behavior. And addiction is not something that people choose, because why would they choose it, right? It's a very unpleasant thing to go through. It's more likely an illness. And so judging someone as less worthy of a medical intervention is arguably a problem. And indeed, it's slightly scary to think that you would deny someone help because you judge them to be undeserving. So we need to be very careful, because that way madness lies, as Shakespeare would say. So we've got to be very, very careful. Okay, so we've started thinking generally about the problem, and we've started working out what could be relevant and what could be irrelevant. Okay, now when it comes to medical ethics, what we're trying to do is to establish a framework, an analytical framework to help us solve the problem. So an analytical framework is basically a set of principles that can help guide us through any problem that might emerge. Now, of course, the problem with setting up quite rigid principles is that a case may come along that doesn't neatly fit, and that could cause us all sorts of problems if we try and force the case to fit the principles. But nonetheless, principles can be useful tools if we are in a pinch and we need to decide something and we want to be able to justify our decision to other people. So these analytical frameworks are really, really useful, really, really important. I think the fundamental way in which they are useful is that they are open, they are accessible. Other people can understand them. The issue with using our gut to solve a problem like this is that other people might not necessarily have access to that way of thinking. What they need is black and white written reasons as to what you've done and why you've done it. And that's where analytical tools come in much more useful. Okay, if you say, I chose the baby girl to get the intervention because I can't explain it, but it just feels right, that's not likely to be good enough. And if you had to say something like that in a coroner's court, then there would be trouble. So you need to be able to justify what you're doing. Now, the OG medical ethicist, and indeed probably one of the OG doctors, full stop, is a man called Hippocrates of Kos. You may have heard of the Hippocratic Oath, for example. Now, this has in it a lot of ethical principles, a lot of analytic frameworks that doctors still apply. Now, it's not the case, at least in the UK, that doctors are required to cite the Hippocratic Oath any longer, but the Hippocratic Oath has an extraordinary amount of relevance, given that it's nearly 2,500 years old. It's still remarkably relevant to the current day. Now, perhaps some of it's not relevant. So Hippocrates starts by saying, I swear by Apollo, the physician, and Asclepius, and Hygeia, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses as my witnesses. Now, these are not contemporary gods and goddesses for many people, so that's not necessarily relevant. But that, according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this contract. I will do no harm or injustice to them. Okay, I will do no harm. I will do no harm. That is one of the foundational principles of medical ethics, and we'll work through the 4 core principles very shortly. But just to sort of stick with good old Hippocrates for a little bit longer, his contemporary relevance is quite remarkable. If we think about contemporary debates around right to choose for women and the abortion debate, which is very hot in the United States of America at the moment in particular. Well, Hippocrates had a view on that, amazingly. I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I'm asked, nor will I advise such a plan, and similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary to cause an abortion. In another sense in which Hippocrates is remarkably relevant to today is with regards to consent and confidentiality. So here's what he says on that topic. Whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, whether in connection with my professional practice or not, which ought not to be spoken of outside, I will keep secret, as considering all such things to be private. Interesting. Okay, so even though this is 2,500 years old, it's still remarkably relevant. It's still sort of grappling with ethical problems that we still grapple with today. So although these ethical principles are incredibly old, I would argue that means they've stood the test of time rather than that they are old hat and irrelevant to our contemporary concerns. And indeed, there are 4 core principles that we can derive from Hippocrates and other ethicists like Aristotle, which still undergird medicine today in the 21st century. And so these include, first of all, respect for autonomy. So that means respecting the patient. Doctors have power. They have the power to provide interventions and to provide support and to move resources around. But in the use of that power, they shouldn't deny the autonomy of the patient as far as they can possibly do so. And that the individual should have some power themselves. They shouldn't be disempowered in the process. So that's an important starting point and something that Hippocrates mentions. Then there's beneficence, which is usually translated as do good, right? Try and help. It's a fairly sort of basic ethical proposition, but worth remembering. And then there's its opposite, non-maleficence, which means do no harm, right? Don't intentionally cause greater harm to a patient. This became particularly relevant and shockingly important as a consequence of the Nazi government, who employed doctors to perform all sorts of horrific experiments on disabled children and people with special educational needs. And they were doing extraordinary amounts of harm. And that was part of the basis for the Nuremberg trials against some of these individuals, was because of maleficence. Okay, and then finally, justice. Treat that which is equal equally, treat that which is not equal unequally, okay? And so this is, the justice point in particular helps us untangle whether or not it's relevant that the baby is a girl and the alcoholic man is a man, because that is not relevant. So their assigned sex should be just treated as an equalizer. It doesn't matter. These are people, first and foremost, and their sex, as far as this particular problem is concerned, is a complete red herring. It's put into the question deliberately to sort of discombobulate and confuse rather than to help. Okay, so what else have we got? Well, we've also got the interesting principle of virtue, which is more commonly associated with Aristotle, very famous Greek philosopher. Now, virtue ethics have gained a little bit more popularity in the last few decades, and what they tend to focus on is not the decision and whether or not that's justifiable, but the decision maker and whether or not that person displays virtues such as courage. Okay, so what Aristotle would argue is that a virtuous person would make the right decision regardless of the circumstances of a case. So if that person had developed within them the virtues like wisdom, like courage, then any problem that arises would be dealt with properly and justifiably. The slight issue with this is, of course, it depends an awful lot on whether or not you do class an individual as virtuous, right? And they could define it for themselves. They could say, well, I'm terribly virtuous, so I've decided this case properly, and you needn't look into it in too much detail because, you know, I'm proper. That could be quite scary. It's also a bit nebulous what things like courage mean. I mean, courage is typically defined as a nice balance point between cowardice and recklessness. But whether or not you would tip over from courage to recklessness or tip backwards from courage to cowardice is very, very vague. And so we need to be slightly careful. Nonetheless, I think Aristotle has a lot to teach us about how we inculcate in ourselves various virtues, such as wisdom, such as thoughtfulness, such as courage, so that we can be more likely to take better decisions than worse decisions. And I suppose thinking about the consequences of our actions, thinking about the decisions that we're taking is virtuous in itself. So that we've come full circle. We've started trying to analyse the decisions that we're taking, but we're also trying to analyze the decision maker. Okay? Right, now let's get back to the problem that we are dealing with the baby girl, the middle-aged man, and the great-grandmother, and try and sort of come up with some fairly concrete analytical tools to solve this puzzle. Now, perhaps one of the most famous ethical conundrums is called the trolley problem. Now, for those of you watching in the UK, this is not a trolley as in the thing you push around a supermarket. It's more like a tram, we would call it in Europe. It's the sort of thing that you would find in US cities like San Francisco. And you can see a picture of a trolley here. And the problem is that it's careering down the tracks, and you are next to a lever, and you can decide to pull the lever or not. Now, if you don't pull the lever, the trolley will just keep going straight on and will kill 5 people, most likely. If you do pull the lever, the trolley will be forced onto a parallel track and will likely kill 1 person. And so the question becomes, what do you do? How would you decide in this instance? Okay, now again, this is not very realistic, so don't get hung up on that. Don't sort of say, well, this would never happen, because sure, it would never happen, but it's still interesting to try and figure it out, right? To try and work out what you might do. So have a little think about how you would act in this scenario. Now, again, start with your gut instinct, and the gut instinct of many people, and don't worry if this is not your gut instinct, by the way, that's not a problem, but the gut instinct of many people would be to do nothing, not to do nothing, to switch the tracks and to encourage the trolley to kill just 1 person rather than kill 5. And that's a sort of a fairly straightforward bit of mathematics, that 5 deaths is worse than 1, and so given the consequences will be worse, let's minimize those, right? And that seems like a perfectly understandable instinct. Okay, now that could be described as consequentialist ethics, okay? In the sense that you are considering the consequences of your action. You're not so focused on the action itself, but what could happen as a consequence of the action. And by acting, by switching the tracks, you lead to fewer deaths, and therefore surely that is the right thing to do, okay? And it may well be, right? And this is a very tricky problem, so there's no problem if you struggle with it, because many people struggle with it. And indeed, the people that came up with it, Philippa Foot and Judith Jarvis Thompson, designed this problem to be really knotty and complicated, so it's fine, okay? Now, an alternative ethical framework is sometimes described as deontological, which is an appalling bit of jargon, but basically what that means is that it's the decision itself that needs to be the focus of our attention, not the consequences. And there are certain sort of core principles, core ethical dictums that we can't ever transgress. And one of those might be don't kill, right? It seems a fairly sort of straightforward proposition, you know, so straightforward, if you like, it's included within the 10 Commandments. And the issue that's being raised with the trolley problem is that you, by switching the tracks, you are actively killing a person. If you did nothing and just allowed the trolley to continue on its path, 5 people would die. But you could absolve yourself from blame for that because you haven't acted, right? So the trolley would have killed them unless you act to move it to a parallel track, right? This is where the problem becomes really interesting, because you have to actively decide whether or not to kill 1 person or stand by and do nothing and, if you like, allow 5 people to die. A deontologist might encourage us to say you can't kill. And so given that you presumably didn't set up this trolley problem, you're not responsible for this horrible scenario playing out, you would be completely within your rights to do nothing and to just stand by in horror as this tragedy unfolds. But if you actively intervene, well, then you've done something that's we can judge. Then you've done something that's ethically questionable. Okay? So how does this help us solve the problem that we had at the start? You know, what's this going to do to help us untangle the question? Right, so let's just recap the question. You've got 1 life-saving intervention available and 3 people in need of it. A baby girl, a middle-aged alcoholic man, and an 8-year-old great-grandmother. Okay, so let's think about the consequentialist ethics. Now, starting with our gut instinct was to save the baby girl. I mean, many people have that gut instinct. Again, if that's not your gut instinct, that's fine, don't worry about it. But anyway, for many people, that would be their go-to, their sort of initial thought. Okay, now, what is the consequentialist ethics going on there? What sort of futures are you trying to bring about through that decision? What sort of end point, if you like? For many people, they are choosing to save the baby for their own sake or for society's sake, because for them it's sort of abhorrent that a society would allow a vulnerable child to die. So the consequence isn't necessarily for the girl, but for society. Now, some would argue, well, the consequence is for the girl because she's got her whole life to live and everything in front of her. But assuming this is a young baby, she wouldn't know that. She would have no sort of cognizance of her capacity to be alive, and so would feel no harm in dying. And I know that sounds terribly callous to say, but that is literally true. And therefore, you could argue that the consequences that we're seeking in saving the girl are not for the girl, but for us. And that's fine. If we acknowledge that that is the calculation we're making, we can make that calculation. But I would suggest that that potentially hits against autonomy of the patient, one of those core principles that Hippocrates highlighted. Because we're not thinking about the patient, we're thinking about ourselves and what would make us happiest. And that's the consequence there. So another way to think about consequentialist ethics would be, who as an individual would be most affected. Now, we've already mentioned that you could argue it's the girl because she has most of her life to live. The baby girl, I mean. And then the grandmother has most likely the least of her life to live, and so the consequences for her as an individual are perhaps minimal. But what about the consequences for the middle-aged man? Now, again, we've sort of suggested that his alcoholism is probably not relevant to this discussion. So we've got to think about, his capacity to live. Now, if he's in the middle of his life, literally, then he's not only aware of the value of his life, he's also got a lot of years left to live. So you could argue that in terms of sort of sheer consequence, he is the person that has the greatest to lose from not receiving your intervention. I mean, if you just measure it within the blunt sort of sense of number of years, he's got the most number of years of being aware of his own existence, and he's also got the most number of years of future life to live. I mean, accepting that the baby girl arguably would have lived longer, but she doesn't have any concept of what living even means. So the man is perhaps the one who would be most impacted in a consequential fashion by your decision. And so therefore we could make a case that he is the one that's most deserving. Not deserving in the sense of worthy of your intervention, but deserving in the consequential sense of will create the greatest impact. Okay? So what about the deontological perspective? How are we supposed to use that? Well, the deontologist would sort of deal with fundamental core principles. And one fundamental principle in medicine, as mentioned, is non-maleficence and benevolence. Do good and don't do harm. And how that translates commonly into medical practice is to do the minimum, do the least possible to ensure that a patient recovers from their ailment. Now, this is a really crucial thing to get your head around. We sometimes look on doctors as superheroes, as able to sort of sculpt nature within their own image. But the vast majority of doctors wouldn't agree with that perception. They would tend to say that doctors just tinker at the margins. They help nature avoid a certain outcome, but they don't force that outcome to come about. In other words, if a patient is incapable of surviving, it doesn't much matter what a doctor does, really. They can't force a patient to live necessarily. The body of that patient needs to be cooperative, if you like. I mean, it's a fairly gross word to use in that context, but the body needs to work with them. And so one principle of medicine and medical ethics is just do the minimum possible, because that will mean that you cause the least harm and you likely do the most good. You're just sort of nudging nature in the right direction. You're not forcing anything. And this again could lead us to the conclusion that it's the man who is perhaps the best placed to receive the treatment, because in all likelihood, again, we're sort of playing with probabilities here, as a middle-aged person, their body would be capable of taking the minimum intervention for the maximal output. Whereas for a baby or for an old lady, they might need a maximal intervention for a relatively minimal consequence. Okay, so that's how the deontologists might help us think about it. Now, another word that's sometimes thrown about in this space is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is a brand of consequentialist ethics, and that's where you try and calculate the utility, which is sometimes described as happiness, but is a slightly sort of broader concept than sheer happiness. And a utilitarian approach to this would be to think about society, really. So this is where we come back to our gut instinct, that if you want to make the most people happy from your decision, and therefore maximize utility within society, then you should probably give the intervention to the baby girl. But medical ethics doesn't typically concern itself with what society would deem appropriate, unless there is a sort of good democratic reason for doing so, because you need to concern yourself for the patient, right? It's the patient's autonomy, it's the patient's well-being that should be front of mind, not society's, not fashion, not trends. And this again is why talking about Hippocrates, despite his 2,500 years of lineage, is still shockingly relevant to today. Now, what about the future? What's next in regards to medical ethics? What's on the horizon, if you like? And quite a lot is likely to change and happen, which is super exciting and interesting. I mean, one of the things that we've already seen quite significant changes in is with regard to consent. And by this I mean that consent is a very important aspect of medical science and medical practice, and it relates to autonomy, that you shouldn't, let's say, operate on a person without them yielding consent if they're able to do so. Okay. Now, because of modern technology and in particular the access to information, people are much more clued up as to what the intervention means and how it could work. So it's quite common nowadays for people to understand to a much greater degree than they did previously what the intervention could mean. They might have done some research about drugs that are available in different jurisdictions. They might be aware of all sorts of things. I mean, they might be deluded. They might have gone on WebMD and decided that they can diagnose themselves and work out their own prognosis and everything. But at the same time, it's likely that people are substantially better informed today about medical science than they were even 20 years ago because of the internet. And that is only likely to improve. And this relates to technology more generally. And in particular, wearable technology is a hugely exciting prospect for medical science, because people will be able to wear tech, or are able to wear tech, that can track all sorts of biomarkers of their health. And that is only going to get more and more sophisticated, such that our watches or rings or all sorts of other devices could give all sorts of incredibly detailed data that would historically have been either unobtainable or very expensive and difficult to obtain. So that is going to yield quite a significant change to medical practice as well. Then there's sort of psychology. Now, human psychology doesn't change terribly fast, but one interesting aspect of contemporary psychology is that we have a bit of an anti-death psychology. And what I mean by that, and it's perfectly understandable, I'm not judging it, is that societies are sort of adamant that death ought not to be allowed. Now, of course, death is unavoidable. Now, it could be that because of declines in religion, people are very scared of what death means, and so they try to avoid it at all costs. And this is a really interesting phenomenon which is becoming more and more pronounced in many societies, is that this sense that death must be avoided at all costs. Now, historically, doctors would have not been quite so sort of adamant that a patient dying was necessarily the worst outcome. It could be that prolonging the patient's life with endless interventions would be vastly more painful for that individual, and that a peaceful death would actually be a better outcome for them. So we do have an interesting psychology around death, which is worth exploring. I don't have a particular view on it, and I know it's a sort of a controversial thing to even mention, but it's worth having a think about yourself. And this, of course, connects with sociology. There is a social fact that we are grappling with, which is that our societies, especially in the West and richer countries, but even in many other parts of the world, are aging very rapidly. So we have a lot more older people, and we need to think about whether or not we continuously prolong people's lives and whether that is the best thing for them. Now, it may be that it is the best thing for us as society because it's important and we cherish these people, of course. But is it in their best interest? It's a very knotty ethical question, and depends, of course, in many cases on the case itself, the specifics of the case. But there's another sort of complication, which is intergenerational justice. How far do we sacrifice certain generations for the benefit of others? It could be said that we pour a lot of healthcare funding towards older people to the expense of younger people. But then conversely, we saw during the pandemic that we perhaps paid greater care and attention to protecting younger people when it was actually older people that were more likely to succumb to the horrible virus. So we have lots of very important and difficult ethical quandaries that we have to try and grapple with. And these will then inform regulations that different governments around the world will implement. And unfortunately, according to the World Health Organization, we haven't experienced the last pandemic of my lifetime. And so we need to be ready for these sorts of horrors to emerge again. And we need to have a good frame of reference to think ethically. Because if we don't have an ethical framework, then we are existing on instinct. And that can be quite dangerous because we won't necessarily be able to communicate those instincts fairly and reasonably to other people who can share them and who can critique them and suggest improvements to them. So the whole point of ethics is, for any practicing doctor to inform their practice and to make sure that they are accountable for all of their decisions and they are aware of what they're doing and they're not just acting on instinct. But for the rest of us in society, it's also essential that we ask and try and answer these incredibly difficult questions because, for one thing, it's important that we have a sense of direction, that we understand each other's motives and that we appreciate what's going on behind an incredibly difficult and perhaps unpleasant decision. More broadly, this approach to metacognition, of thinking about our thinking, of interrogating our instincts and trying to justify them and perhaps trying to improve on them, is just an incredibly useful and important intellectual skill. Getting better at thinking about our thinking and not just allowing gut instinct to rule is an incredibly good idea. Okay, and that's true of anyone, regardless of which degree you're thinking of pursuing or which subject, or indeed anything to do with your life. A bit of metacognition helps everyone, I would argue. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time, I hope. All the best. Bye now.